everybody could start taking their seats, because we would be starting in about 1 minute. That would be fantastic, thank you.
Good idea. Oh, great. Yeah. And that should be out tomorrow.
Right, thanks everybody for coming. It's great to have such a great turnout for tonight's event. My name is Allister Heath and I'm the editor of City AM, and I'm going to be chairing this event for the next hour and a half or so. This is a great subject which is introducing a great little pamphlet. It's a manifesto fit for 2015, 15 ideas to transform Britain. So it's 15 for 2015, which I think is quite a catchy kind of name for a think tank publication. And we've got a great panel today, all of whom have helped to write this wonderful little manifesto. I'm going to quickly introduce them. Starting on my far left is Chris Skidmore, who's the Member of Parliament for Kingswood. Then we've got Dominic Raab, the Member for Ashton-Walton. Kwasi Kwarteng, who was elected for Spectator in May 2010. James Forsyth, the political editor of the Spectator and columnist for the Mail on Sunday and a former colleague of mine. And Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. And this is a joint IEA and Free Enterprise Group event, and the Free Enterprise Group, just in case you've not heard of it, is a very exciting grouping of MPs and people who are interested in thinking about new ideas to renew Britain and kickstart the economy. At the end of this event, you'll be able to pick up a copy of the paper on your way out, and there'll also be a device for you to sign up if you're interested in being put onto the IEA's mailing lists and being invited to similar events in London in the future. So anyway, every speaker is going to have up to 7 minutes to talk about what they want to talk about, and if they want, they can speak for less, but if possible, not for more, because the idea is to sort of open it up for questions and have a Q&A and get people involved and have a chat about some of these really exciting ideas. So we'll start off with Chris Skidmore on my left. Oh right, okay, well, I mean, left to right, right to left doesn't make much of a difference.
I mean, nothing that's happened.
I'll go first. That's what happens when you try and chair MPs.
Well, it's competition, it's the spirit of free enterprise. No monopoly on charity.
Well, thank you very much for coming along to this event. I'm sure you've had a fantastic conference and we're drawing near to the close. There are now, I think, roughly, if I can remember Grant Chap's countdown clock that's been established in CCHQ, about 940 days left till the general election. It results in Ulster nearly less than 30 months to go. And if you think back to 2007, where we were before the 2010 general election, at this equivalent time in the cycle, we'd already had the policy groups having been reported, and we'd already had some major policy announcements. Now, I know that in terms of the government, overwhelmingly will have to depend on its record and its financial record when it comes to 2015, but that shouldn't stop us being bold and thinking of new ideas. After all, that is what party conferences are for. I wanted to talk about sort of 3 ideas that I put forward in this pamphlet. So I'm on the Health Select Committee. I've got a particular interest in social care. The challenge, as we know, of the 21st century is an ageing population. People are becoming increasingly nervous about tackling their old age and what that might mean. We've seen already the government move extremely fast on issues of social care, putting more money into social care than ever before, and actually moving towards the proposal set out of the Littlewood Commission. But nevertheless, we still have to tackle the problem of how do we encourage people to save for their long-term care. And in fact, how can we incentivise people to save for care? In particular, I'm very interested in the idea of a care ISA, by which people might actually be able to put money up to possibly the cap for the deal proposals, into tax-free savings account at any particular time, but also that when it comes to social care, we need to actually look at completely revolutionising the social care market by means of direct payments. At the moment, too many social care packages are dictated by local authorities, and in fact, actually, we offered direct cash payments to people to decide how they would like to spend their own care packages. We could actually completely transform the market. Moving on to another topic of great concern for people, their children's education. Michael Gove today was set out of how the academies, movements and free schools is having sort of tremendous success in transforming the lives of children. Yet we've seen yesterday Boris talking about selection in schools. Now, grammar schools have always been a sort of controversial topic for the Conservative Party, partly because our old policy of a grammar school in every town is quite simply unworkable. But that shouldn't mean that we should reject selection completely out of hand. What we've seen, the problem with grammar schools in the past and the opponents of grammar schools have been that in certain catchment areas you've seen house prices rise and people actually buy places at grammar schools. But we should go back to the original vision of what a grammar school was, which is to look after the poorest in society. And I believe actually if we adopt current structural models, we could set up excellence academies that would take that historic principles of grammar schools, mean-tested selection. Now, at what income cap level that might be is yet to be decided. But also, most importantly, instead of an 11 plus, a rather artificial cut-off point, we have already in place, this government set up, Everton Academy has set up a footballing academy where the poorest pupils who are particularly good at sport can be selected. Now, if you can be hot-housed as an athlete, if you can be hot-housed as a footballer, if Dave Beckham can be chosen by a talent scout at the age of 9 in order to become a successful footballer, then there is little reason why we should not apply those same principles to academic excellence. And by the way, also technical excellence. I believe that if we're going to have parity of esteem between vocational subjects and academic subjects, we also need to begin selecting at a vocational and technical level. Now, this may be controversial, but I believe pilots set up that actually tackle the problem from the left. I mean, one of Michael Gove's great successes was to focus on pupils on free school meals, because it meant that rather than the Conservatives simply being perceived to be looking after their own, actually we were making real transformations in educational standards through the poorest pupils in society. This would allow us to ensure that those people for whom an education, regardless of their background, is actually genuinely a passport to a better life, would ensure that they got that chance. Now, in terms of the selection, you could have talent scouts going into primary schools, working with primary school teachers, but that wouldn't also rule out the fact that at any stage during a secondary school career, you could have permeable selection where pupils of these schools who weren't performing may have to leave those schools, and actually excellent pupils who develop later on in life could then join the Excellence Academy. We should really be valuing academic work, hard work, the best and the brightest in our country. Selection is a fact of life. It's in every workplace, and we need to ensure that we get the best and the brightest. We know that we are falling behind in the international league tables, and we need to ensure that those pupils, particularly from the poorest backgrounds, get that chance in life. Moving away slightly from the grammar schools principle, but absolutely enshrining what grammar schools stand for. And finally, my third idea was on immigration. Now, for myself, as a candidate in a marginal Labour seat which I won, it was the biggest issue on the door. It still remains the biggest issue on the door. The Coalition has done fantastic work in capping immigration, but I think people don't quite perceive numbers. The problem with immigration is not simply the numbers coming into the country, it is actually the link between welfarism and immigration. We need to break that understanding that people coming to this country can automatically be entitled to certain benefits. I'd like to copy what has happened in the States, the green card system, where in fact we wouldn't penalise those immigrants who are coming in, the best and the brightest, who are genuinely here to integrate and work hard. The principle of a green card in this country, which we call an enterprise card, would be for those high-value immigrants, you'll be able to place a quota on the numbers coming in, quotas depending on whatever country, just in the same way in the States is set, but at the same time, those people would not be allowed to claim benefits, they would not be able to claim for NHS treatment, they would not be able to claim the full rights of a UK citizen until at least they paid 10 years of tax. And that would ensure that actually we'd have a far more homogeneous society, that actually people would understand the value of immigration for this country, that actually those people who come here, who are fighting and are aspirational, are on the same playing field as British citizens who at the moment do not believe that they are paying into the system and they are seeing other people take away from this.
Great, that was a fascinating set of ideas and a great start to this session. Dominic Raab, do you want to be next?
Very good. Well, first of all, thank you, Allister, and thank you, Mark and the IEA, for organising this event. It's actually, believe it or not, a historic anniversary on which to consider the task of rebuilding British economic competitiveness. And the historians amongst you, like Kwasi, will know that in the early hours of this morning, 53 years ago, Margaret Thatcher was elected to Parliament for the very first time. But also, 45 years ago today, Che Guevara was shot deep in the heart of the Bolivian jungle. Now, what do I draw from this coincidence of history? I think that we're going to need the dual inspiration of Margaret Thatcher's ideas and the fighting spirit of Che if we're going to revive the British economy from its current stupor. And I think the first thing I want to say is really set some context to this. Let's remember, public spending as a percentage of GDP rose by a whopping 14% under the last government. And most of that took place well before the recession, despite what we constantly hear from Labour shadow ministers, and it excludes the cost of the banking bailouts. That silent takeover by the state has overcrowded free enterprise, and we've really got a task on our hands to reverse it. So given the state of growth today, my #1 priority will be finding the savings to deliver a big, substantial supply-side tax cut to businesses, especially focused on the SMEs and startups who create the most jobs. And I'm not sure that just constantly salami slicing programme budgets is going to be the whole answer. I think we need to look wholesale at government bureaucracy and government departments in the same way the Canadians did when they cut their deficit. And so what are the options? I'm just going to give you a menu. You can all decide your favourite department to cut, I'm sure. But there's already proposals underway. There's already consideration from the government and the Treasury of whether DCMS might be cut. The Lib Dems previously proposed BIS as a candidate for the CHOP. Personally, I don't think we need 2 departments for the environment, not least because of the contradictory messages and the lack of integration that you have in policy. I'd get rid of the Government Equalities Office in a jiffy, and whatever you think of spending on aid, put the programme budget aside for one moment. I would put DFID back in the Foreign Office as a matter of political and policy coherence, which would save over $1 billion a year without even touching programme spending. That's the way we could pay for a substantial cut in income tax, in national insurance employers' contributions, corporation tax, business rights. That would give the private sector the shot in the arm it needs to fire up growth, to create more jobs, and by the way, that's the sustainable way to spur demand without incurring yet more debt, whether it's household or government. That's my first proposal. My second would be to really seriously overhaul business red tape. I wrote, almost a year ago now, a pamphlet for another think tank that I won't mention in front of Mark, called Escaping the Straitjacket. And I set out 10 particular policies, 10 particular items that I would change. But the main aims ought to be, just to give you a picture, cut the burden of red tape on startups and small businesses, things like the minimum wage, flexible working, pension auto-enrolment. But at the same time, strengthen the powers of employment tribunals to strike out the spurious and vexatious claims that really paralyse small businesses and medium-sized enterprises. And bear in mind, those reforms, the cuts to red tape, would not cost the taxpayer a penny. And I don't just see this as an economic priority. I don't look at this as a sort of accountant doing a bean counting exercise. I actually see it just as much as a social priority. And I make no apologies for standing up for the wealth creators and the employers who create the jobs and generate the revenue. But actually, first and foremost, I'm on the side of the 22% youth who today find themselves unemployed. And we've got to stand up for them. If it's not us, who does speak up for them? And if Labour want to put themselves, or the Lib Dems for that matter, on the other side of that debate, then personally, as a Conservative, I'd be very happy to pick that fight. Finally, the third point I wanted to make, and the third element I wanted to look at, is Britain's productivity problem. Now, there are many aspects to that, as we all know. Roads, rail and airport infrastructure, the skills gap, a major issue. But we can't continue to ignore another salient issue, which is the minority of militant union leaders who shame their movement through reckless and vindictive strike action. And you only have to look at the PCS union led by Mark Sawatka trying to sabotage the Olympics with just 11% support from his own members. Not one public sector strike under this coalition has had a majority of support from their own membership. Something to think about as we reel from 2011, where we suffered the most working days lost to strikes for over 20 years. But it's not just the cost of strikes when they happen that I think is something that we should be concerned about. It's also the success of this very small group, it has to be said, even amongst the union movement, a small group of militants who drive up wage inflation in the public sector, and the veto that people like Bob Crow think that they've got the right to wield over major infrastructure upgrades, whether it's on the tube or on our rail network. So my third proposal would be a change in the law to impose a condition for strike action in the transport sector, in the emergency services. There are possibly other sectors people might want to look at, so that strikes would be required to have the support of a majority of union members before proceeding. Let me be clear about this. It's not about attacking rank and file union members. They feel increasingly dislocated from the hardline union bosses, the sort of caviar communists on the six-figure salaries, who can quite happily afford to sit out strike action because they're not on the low and middle incomes. It is about putting a safeguard in place to protect the hard-working majority in the private and the public sector alike from what is a growing abuse of power. Thank you very much.
Excuse me. Thank you very much. I also happened to read today that it was our Prime Minister's 46th birthday. I might be wrong. I think it is today, so this is a significant anniversary, which I'm glad to be celebrating in this fashion. My three ideas, two of which relate to the deficit and taxation, which I think is going to frame the political debate for the next 10, 15 years. The situation we got ourselves into over the last 15 years has been appalling. We've run the highest peacetime deficit we're coming in 2010 since 1945, and the extent to which our problems are self-inflicted is shown by the way in which, when this government came in, the deficit to GDP ratio was 12%, 11.5%, 12%. And the government, it's a credit to the government that we've actually narrowed that to about 8%. But this rate, this ratio, was similar to Greece and no other European countries. They all had lower deficits than we did. And as a consequence of this, I've spent time looking at the way in which other countries manage their fiscal policy. And I think the days that we could have a discretionary policy in which governments or the Chancellor was allowed or were allowed essentially to make up their own rules, I think they've got to stop. And as a consequence of this, my first policy, excuse me, is to introduce a debt brake, which essentially is a balanced budget provision. Now, those of you who know about our constitution will know that it's not a written constitution. So people always say, well, we can't amend the constitution in a way to have this debt brake. But the principle is very clear. And what it means, and if you will bear with me, is that our structural deficit should be balanced every year. So you only allow for adjustments, what are called the automatic stabilizers. So when the economy is depressed, obviously benefits will go up, and the reverse when the economy is growing. But why this is crucially important is that when Labour got re-elected in 2001, they essentially ran deficits every single year until 2007, 2008. So what that meant was that the rate at which they were spending was going up faster than economic growth in many ways, and the cumulative effect of their spending decisions meant that our deficit, when the crash came, was far worse than our competitors and than it should have been. And it was far worse than historically had been the case, even when Labour went to the IMF cap in hand in 1975 to 1976. The deficit to GDP ratio was about 7%. So that just shows the scale of the problem we had. and the problem was created by very lax public spending on the part of Gordon Brown, who was then the Chancellor. My second idea is related to this, but it's more structural. The expansion of the British state over the last 30 years in terms of the spending levels has essentially been financed by middle-income earners. The top rate of tax, which is 40%, not the super tax, but the top rate, was never designed to be paid for by House of Commons PAs or by PAs in the city. It was never designed for those people. But as a consequence of the fact, and this relates to a policy that James is going to put forward, we've had bracket creep. The top rate of tax has not actually been increasing. It's actually stayed the same, and in actual fact, it's going to go down. So it's going to kick in at £34,370 in 2012 to 13. And according to the IFS, an independent think tank, the number of higher rate taxpayers will increase from 3.7 million in 2011 to 5 million by 2014. And those are the IFS figures. Now, anyone can see that a society in which middle earners, the bulk of the population is taxed to this degree, is not creating the incentives that we would like to see, and that actually would result in a more successful economy and better growth. And there's a lot of academic research. There's a gentleman called Edward Prescott, who I believe won the Nobel Prize in 2004, who's shown that over time, a higher threshold actually increases people's work rate. They work more, that people are incentivized to work. Now, in terms of costing, and the Treasury always want to cost these tax cuts, it would cost about £4 billion. And so we would have to look at things like VAT and other indirect taxes in which to make the shortfall. But I think that over time, this would create a much more incentivized middle class and would eventually lead to a more prosperous country. So I would raise the top rate of the basic rate to £40,000 so that people start paying the 40% rate at £50,000, because it was never designed to capture the numbers of people that it has done. And Norman Lamont said the same thing. He said that the only problem is that it's expensive, but the idea that we can carry on taxing millions and millions of people in this bracket and expect a prosperous society, I think that idea is an ambitious one. The third idea I have is relating to planning. I've been on record, as it were, to expand Heathrow. I think there should be a third runway. I think we should have got on with this many years ago. And I know this is a controversial view, but I think that with regard to aviation, I think the world isn't standing still. If you go to Dubai, they'll say that they're going to be the #1 international hub by 2016, while we debate what the best course of action is. And I think one of the problems we have is the political problem. People feel naturally very concerned about noise pollution. They feel very concerned about their environment, as they should be. So this debate becomes an intensely toxic and political one. Now, what I would like to see is more compensation for people affected by these planning decisions and by these big infrastructure projects. This is what has happened in France over many decades, where if you look at Charles de Gaulle, the people were compensated, their houses were bought at 20% above the market rate. And there were, in fact, in that instance, many cases in which people bought houses in the area knowing that the government would compensate them. I mean, that was how effective, in a way, that compensation scheme was. And I think that the issue that we have with planning is that it's a legal battle. If Dominic and I are in neighbouring constituencies and we have a planning dispute, for instance, we would go to the courts, we'd spend money on lawyers, and once we'd gone through all the legal process, there would be a victor who essentially would take all the spoils, metaphorically, and someone who lost out. Whereas what I'm suggesting is that if we have an adequate compensation scheme, in particular to projects, national projects like runways, like railways, the person affected can capture more of that economic value, and as a consequence, they won't necessarily welcome the development, but it does soften the planning decision. And it does actually, I think, alleviate a lot of the political difficulties that we have that are associated with big infrastructure projects in this country. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is James Forsyth.
Hello, thank you to Allister for chairing and to the IEA for hosting and to you all for coming. My first idea picks up on Kwasi's idea. It's simply that we should link the tax threshold to earnings. Under the last Labour government, the number of people paying a high rate of tax doubled. That wasn't because people had grown vastly more prosperous. It was essentially because of the Gordon Brown had a deliberate policy of fiscal drag to pull more and more people into the top rate. The best way to remove that temptation for politicians is to create an automatic link between the tax threshold and earnings. That's not going to solve the problems that Kwasi was talking about how many more people have been dragged into it already, but it will stop the problem from getting progressively worse. And I think the case for it is actually made very clearly by what Boris Johnson said in his speech today. He was talking about how he wanted to help Londoners for whom the housing market was a sheer cliff on which, unless they had family money, they had no hope of getting up. And he said that he was talking about people earning between £30,000 and £63,000 a year. Now that most of those people are paying a high rate of tax. It's a mad system we've got where people who are paying a high rate of tax can't afford to get on the property ladder in the capital city. That, I think, suggests that this rate is kicking in far too low. And although this is merely a policy designed to prevent this situation from getting worse, I think it's a first step towards beginning to deal with this problem. My second idea is borrowed shamelessly from Ronald Reagan. It's for very generous but very time-limited capital allowances. I think it's quite clear looking at the economy now that the economy needs a stimulus. But the problem is I think fiscal stimulus is very difficult to do given how deep the deficit is and how bad the national debt is, and there's obviously a risk that if the government were to announce it was doing fiscal stimulus, that would have a knock-on effect on Britain's standing in international credit markets. Where I think there is a possibility for a stimulus is a private sector stimulus. Companies have about 60 billion of excess working capital, of money that they could spend. They don't want to spend it now, partly because of a lack of confidence, partly because of concerns about what might blow in from across the channel if the Eurozone crisis becomes more acute. But I think one way to incentivise companies to invest this cash pile would be to say to them, we'll give you very generous capital allowances to buy new equipment, but these capital allowances will run out in a year's time. Reagan did it, it worked. I think it's well worth trying in the current circumstances. My third idea is owed to Allister Heath, really, which is when Allister Heath was working at the Spectator, when we were colleagues, Allister did a whole series of quite brilliant articles adding up what the actual out-of-work number was. This was when Gordon Brown was Chancellor, and everyone believed that the economic debate was over, that there was a new economic model and everything was hunky-dory. And Allister was one of the people who pointed out that no, this isn't true, and that the unemployment rate was actually far higher than the official figures suggested, because people had simply been moved on to other out-of-work benefits. I think honesty requires us to admit that this started under the Conservative government after the pit closures. Lots of people being put onto things like incapacity benefit rather than onto unemployment rolls. But I think we need to remove that temptation from the government to try and fiddle the figures. And I mean, the Office for National Statistics should simply issue a number for all the people on claiming any kind of out-of-work benefit. If that became the headline figure that we all discussed, it would remove the temptation for politicians to try and shuttle people from one benefit onto another benefit, and instead place the onus on getting more and more people into work. And I think if you look at what's going on with the universal credit and the attempt to always make sure that work pays, I mean, this strikes me as a kind of necessary side effect of that in terms of telling us whether these policies really are working or not. But look, on the grounds that the questions of these things are always as interesting as the panel, if not more so, I will now pass over back to Allister.
And James, I think the last point is an excellent idea. Mark.
Thank you. Allister, thanks. I'm going to stand up if you don't mind. You might be able to see me, but If I'm going to say something controversial, I like to see the whites of the eyes. I should start with Allister, thank you very much for chairing today's meeting, and thank you also for the front page coverage that City AM gave this Fringe meeting this morning. We're particularly grateful for that. Totally unrelated, Allister didn't know he was chairing the meeting until a couple of hours ago, so I can promise they are unrelated. Here are my 3 ideas. One of them builds on what Dominic was saying about SMEs. I want a policy to make it easier to start up a business in the United Kingdom. I assert that the hardest thing to do if you're starting up a business is to move from sole trader status and take the first 2 or 3 rungs on the ladder, to take on your first batch of MPs. And it's worth underscoring how important small and medium-sized enterprises are for our economy. They account for about 60% of private sector employment, about half of private sector turnover. 1 in 1,000 of these very small businesses will go on to be the giant businesses of tomorrow. And if we are particularly concerned about those disadvantaged members of society, those who are generally on the poorer end of the spectrum, SMEs have a track record of employing more part-time workers, more women, more people at both ends of the age spectrum, both the very young and the very old, and those who have below average educational benefits, qualifications. So my policy is to help get these new businesses off the ground. If somebody has a business idea, they can implement it in a flexible and sensible fashion. What would I do? I would change employment law to allow you to take on your first 12 employees, your first 12, on a self-employed consultant basis. No questions asked. Not as full PAY employees with all of the benefits that people who work for big companies and in the public sector get. Your first 12 employees come on a consultant basis for both tax reasons and for employment law reasons. If you're setting up your new company, often you've probably got 3 or 4 different ideas, you're not sure which one's going to work out. You might have to have the flexibility of, for example, doubling your marketing department and closing down another part of your operation that isn't working. If you're an entrepreneur and you start looking through employment law in this country, in my view, you are very likely to leave the brilliant idea you've got in your head rather than actually implement it by setting up a company. And I think allowing those first 12 to be employees, no questions asked, will be treated as self-employed consultants, not as those with full employment rights, would help get those businesses off the ground and entrepreneurial ideas implemented in practice. I should say, as an independent advisor to the government's Red Tape Challenge, I did advise this policy to the Department of Biz. They spent a little bit of time telling me that businesses could do this anyway, and finally said that the idea was actually far too radical and they couldn't possibly implement it. So I'm not quite sure which it is. But I think to make it absolutely plain and straightforward that would help our startups. My second idea builds on an area of coalition policy which I think is meeting with some degree of success, welfare reform. But I think that the reforms that Ian Duncan-Smith is bringing in need to be the first step in transforming welfare, not the final word. Ian Duncan-Smith has quite correctly analysed and is dealing with the absolute insanity in this country that some people might be better off on benefits than they are in gainful employment. It beggars belief that we've allowed a welfare system to emerge that creates those disincentive effects to actually enter work. But I fear it's not quite enough. And indeed, some of the more pessimistic suggestions are that the effective rate of tax that you might face even after the welfare reforms have gone through is 97%. That's to say that you would have 97p if you were on welfare, £1 if you were in work. Yeah, you would be better off in work, but is that a big enough financial incentive to really get you into the workplace? I don't think it is. So my suggestion is this. I would like to take Bill Clinton's policy, and I'd also like to return to Beveridge's original vision of the welfare state. The original vision of the welfare state was it would provide support at sustenance levels for a temporary period of time. That's clearly in the Beveridge report. Now, we might have a more generous view in 2012 of what sustenance constitutes than we had in 1940, but I wanted to focus on the temporary point. I think if you are on benefits associated to being out of work and you're looking for work, after 6 months your benefit should be cut by 10%. and after another 6 months they should be cut by a further 10%. That's the sort of window we're trying to provide you to find alternative employment. Furthermore, we can't just make it financially marginally better to be in work. We've got to tackle the leisure gap. I believe if you are an able-bodied person and a community is paying for your living expenses, we can expect you to work in the community. 30 hours a week, I would suggest, for all able-bodied people. There have to be safeguards in place. You would have to make sure that you weren't, if you like, sacking street cleaners only to replace them with people who are on unemployment benefit. So all of the new work that local councils, I suggest, might find would have to be new work or work which would otherwise be undone, which would go by default. There's plenty of it in where I live in Battersea. I think that those who are living at the expense of the community can be expected to put in 30 hours work for the community whilst they are on out-of-work benefits. My third point also builds on an area where I think the Coalition has taken a first few tentative steps, and that's on education. I think what Michael Gove's done in the free schools area is potentially revolutionary, and I warmly welcome it. But he based a lot of his reforms on Sweden, but didn't grasp the nettle of the most important part of the Swedish free schools programme, namely that you can run schools in Sweden for a profit. And whilst I heartily applaud people like Tony Young and other true heroes who are actually setting up free schools, often in the face of militant opposition by local councils and local education authorities, unless we bring the profit motive in, we will not get enough of it. And I think we should be unembarrassed about this. If in this country we accept that you can make a very tidy sum of money by running a chain of restaurants or running a chain of hotels, it is beyond me why you can't make money by running a chain of schools that actually makes our children numerate and literate. A far better service to society, I would suggest, than running hotels and restaurants. The profit motive has to be embedded in the system. And the experience in Sweden is that the for-profit schools have been particularly successful in disadvantaged areas. And I fear that we might see on the free schools that they're set up in areas that are already relatively well catered for, relatively affluent areas, but not in the areas where our educational standards are the lowest and people need them the most. So bring in the profit motive in schools is my third idea. I just want to end with one prediction as we're talking about the 2015 general election. It's been a strange sort of party conference season. Id Miliband claiming to be the new Disraeli and One Nation politician, and George Osborne saying yesterday they're calling on the workers of the world to unite. I was trying to work out which party conferences I've been to or been part of in the last couple of years. But I will make one prediction, and it's a prediction about the outcome of the next election that I'm very confident will come true, about which party is going to win the next election. I'm certain I'm right on this. The party that wins the next election will be the Workers' Party. What is yet to be determined is whether that party is the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. And I think some of the ideas in this document would actually make the Conservative Party the new Workers' Party if you were bold enough to adopt it. Thanks very much for your time.
Right, thank you very much for all those great ideas, very interesting and very exciting ideas, and I'm sure everybody in the room has got something to say about this, and questions and criticisms and so on. So we're now going to open the proceedings up for questions. I think the best way to proceed is, well, before we start, who wants to ask the first question? I'm sure someone wants to ask the first question. Right, gentleman over there, does anyone have a microphone?
Yeah,
yes, Ruth has got a microphone. If you could tell us who you are and who you work for, or your affiliation.
I'm Jay Morrison, I'm with the Hull Conservative Future. A lot of your ideas I agree with wholeheartedly, but I think there's a potential with prisons to make an economic benefit. It currently costs billions of pounds to keep our prisoners in prison over a 10-year period. We should be getting those people into work. They can then contribute for their time in prison. They could give compensation to the victims and families that they have hurt in their time, and they would also be able to have a little bit more for when they leave prison. I think there was this case in Hull where a drug dealer went to prison for 2 years, left with £30 in his bank account, and in the same night, he was arrested after burglaring 2 homes to get more money. So it's obviously a problem, and if someone has money, they have a stake in society, so then they're not going to re-offend, which could help us economically.
Okay. And so is your question basically what the panel thinks about this proposal? Okay. Before we just go to another question, and then we will. There's a gentleman over there in a blue tie.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Phil Bicknell from the Royal Borough of Windsor Maidenhead. I was interested on I used to employ 35 people some years ago. I don't employ anybody now because the risk is too great. And I'm sorry I don't know your name, the 12 employees as self-employed rings where it needs to be. The fact is that we're never going to employ mass people anymore. It's down to SMEs to do this business. And the question is, how long would you expect the 12 employees to be able, how long would you expect us to be able to do that for? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, a couple of questions. Who wants to do it?
My name's Mark. Thanks, Phil. My view is permanently. If your company successfully grows from 12 employees to 10,000, then that's fine. You can still have any 12 who are self-employed. I am, suggesting or accepting that the other 988 would have to be on PAYE. So my problem only helps you on the first rung of the ladder. But if you set up your company, your first 12 are self-employed, and you end up being Microsoft or Google, I'm not going to take that plank away from you any time. I'm just trying to get you onto rung 4 on the ladder. Just on the prisoners' point, well, perhaps if the next general election was going to be in 2016, we could have had 16 ideas, but we decided to have 15 ideas. I've got a lot of sympathy with this, but I think a bit like my workfare idea, it needs a little bit of thinking about, because what you don't want to do is to have people who are without a criminal record in the legitimate workforce who get displaced because you can get somebody cheaper to do it in prison who's been convicted of an armed robbery. I mean, that would not be reasonable. And I think it would be a bit difficult as well if you were, say, in prison for fraud and were a successful hedge fund manager, whether it would be considered appropriate that with a laptop and a Wi-Fi connection you could continue about your business in a normal way. But in terms of the costs of people being in prison, I'm not an expert on this head, but it just strikes me as shockingly high. I mean, people sort of say the cost of keeping somebody in prison is about the same as staying at the Ritz Hotel or something for a year. This is insane. So I'm certainly interested in what ideas can be done to get the per capita cost of prisoners considerably down. And I agree that there is a question of skills and work, but it needs to be treated carefully, not so as not to displace legal citizens who are illegitimate.
Thank you. Dominic Raab, would you like to answer the prison point?
Yes, I think it's a great point. I remember HMP Coldingley in Surrey, which had a graphic design studio coming in and engaging prisoners, working for all the reasons you said, skilling them up, giving them the prospects of some work experience so that they can go straight on the outside, also helping them earn a bit of money so they can pay some compensation. It was closed prematurely because of a whole load of government bureaucracy. Actually, if you read Chris Graydon's speech today, the very first thing he talks about is the Clink, which is a business working with one of, I think it's one of his local prisons. But in any event, and he took time out. The headlines tomorrow on his speech will be all about householder protection and 2 strikes and you're out. But actually, spent a lot of the time in that speech saying, this isn't a return to hang them and flog them, but actually there are some sensible win-wins here, including getting prisoners working. So I think you're absolutely on point.
Great, thank you. Let's have a few more questions. Let's first start with the gentleman over there, please.
Phil Sage, Windsor. My question actually is on the time of the capital allowances. Why doesn't, I think that's not ambitious enough. Why doesn't Britain do the same as Germany and allow 100% capital deduction in the first year? There is no depreciation, it's all able to be deducted. You're competing with Germany in industry, why not?
Okay, thank you. Gentleman in the front row.
Yes.
Just 1 second, the microphone's coming.
Good. Yes, Jeremy Child, representing Harrow West or Penrith Northwood Concerned Association in North West London. 2 points that you may think they're completely the opposite of the spectres, but I'll explain them. I was very pleased, Dominic, to hear your views on trade unions. This has always been my one thing that makes my blood boil. I work for a learning disability charity, and I'm afraid I gave the staff at the London Borough of Harrow a piece of my mind when they went out on strike withdrawing their services along with these militant unions. I make myself very unpopular, but I can't help it. So on unions, what I want to ask you, please, why is this government being blackmailed by Bob Crow? I understand that every time he asks for money, even Boris budgets because he doesn't want strikes and gives what he wants. If they're not going to be able to make it illegal to strike, why can't we just say people strike, everything is withdrawn, and stick to it, make the point, and they'll soon learn. I'm really very concerned about how soft we're going on unions. Now, on the other, you might say extreme, I'd just like to take up this gentleman on a point he made about working for 30 hours. Just let you into a story. I was actually unemployed for 4.5 months 2 years ago when I lost my job in industry. It happened the 3rd time I'm in procurement in industry. I was looking for a job constantly. The job people, I had a big argument with them. I wrote to my MP, he got onto David Cameron because they were complaining about me doing voluntary work and I can't do this and I can't do that. So I was doing everything to do voluntary work and look for a job. But I think it would be unfair on someone like me who's working day and night to look for a job if you said to me, you've got to do 30 hours as well just to get job seekers alive. Because I assure you that there wasn't a minute in the day when I wasn't applying for jobs when I was unemployed.
All right, thank you very much for those 2 questions. Thanks. That's 3 questions, so I think that's enough for us to be able to answer some of them. Shall we start off with capital allowances? James?
Yeah, to a gentleman from Windsor, I mean, I think that's a fantastic idea. I'm happy to go further and faster. I mean, my idea is simply the principle of how do we find a way to get companies to move some of this money they're sitting on and how to start spending their cash piles. If that's a better way of doing it, I'm completely happy. I also think that you're onto a very important point, and one of the things which I think the Free Enterprise Group has been very good at doing is looking at the countries that Britain is competing against. We've got to aim to be, to borrow a phrase from John Major, we've got to aim to be the enterprise capital of Western Europe, and that will require, quite simply, having the most competitive corporate and personal tax system of any European country. And so I'd be happy to match the Germans on that. Just quickly on the tube point, one of the things I've noticed about Bob Crow is I think Bob Crow is rapidly losing the support of his members at a quite striking rate, because I've noticed that with every tube strike now, the tube keeps on working. The most recent...
should.
No, it should. No, sure. I'm not saying it should.
You should give it to them.
What I'm saying is that Bob Crow is so extreme and he's undercutting himself. And the last tube strike, there was basically no difference at all from how the tube normally operates, which isn't brilliant, but it's still functioning.
Thanks to Boris, obviously.
No, but I mean, that would be my point on that one.
Okay, thanks. Kwasi Kwarteng, do you want to talk about capital allowances?
I want to say, I think the point that you made, the gentleman made about capital allowances was excellent. And that's exactly the kind of route that we want to go down. And I just want to say almost on a theoretical basis, why capital allowances are so important. And we have households which are still struggling under huge amounts of debt. They're paying it off, but they're struggling under debt. So we're not going to get much economic growth from the consumer, even if we wanted to. The government is staggering under a big deficit. So government spending is not the answer to this problem. I think our export base is still very small compared to the size of the economy. So to bet on expanding exports aggressively is, I think, a long-term solution. So the only answer is to try and unlock the cash on these balance sheets of corporates. And a generous system of capital allowances is one way of doing that. Another way is the corporation tax. But I think capital allowances are a more effective way of stimulating the kind of investment that we need to see. And just to reiterate, and that's the framework, that's why we're focusing on capital allowances at the moment, because it is a fact that British companies have huge amounts of cash. And I think I just wanted to add and support James's point, that if we're serious about making Britain an internationally competitive force in the economy, this is exactly the route we need to go down. And I would extend, as you suggest, the allowances that we've recommended.
Dominic Raab.
Yeah, just briefly on the unions point, I mean, there is a small minority with whom there is no reasoning. That strikes me as obvious. I did any questions with Mark Sawatka. He doesn't think a penny should be taken in cuts, not one penny. So, and he's going to continue attacking the government whilst there is any deficit reduction. But I also think it needs to be handled very carefully. You just have to look at the oil haulage strike and how easy it was for Len McCluskey to turn that around on the government. But the other point I wanted to make is I proposed this threshold in April 2011, and I was told I was the right wing, this, that, and all that stuff. In November, YouGov found by 2-to-1 the specific proposal I put forward carried public support. By September of this year, YouGov ran the same poll again, a couple of Sunday times back, and found 3-to-1 public support. So I don't think this is a right-wing idea at all. I suspect there's quite a lot of public sector workers amongst that 3-to-1 majority.
Mark,
just on the workfare requirement. I didn't say this in my remarks, but I did just check what I'd written in the brochure. And I do suggest that there should be a universal workfare requirement after 6 months. That you may say that's arbitrary, but I think you said, sir, that you were out of work for about 4.5 months.
Well, yeah, but BB, as I was doing voluntary work anyway.
That's fine. I'm giving 6 months. I'm giving each person 6 months to find a new job. I'm not saying that that's easy, but I'm assuming that that's what they're spending their time doing. After 6 months, however, you have to be expected to give back to the community that asks. And where this was trialled I say trialled, I mean actually carried out in Wisconsin, the success of it was enormous. It wasn't so much that you had large numbers of unemployed people who were suddenly at the park gates at 8 o'clock in the morning clearing litter or scrubbing graffiti from the walls. There was an element of that. But when, if you like, a life of leisure at the expense of the taxpayer was no longer an option, remarkably enough, these people started to actually find jobs in the private sector of the economy, because the choice was no longer whether you wished to claim benefits or work. The question was whether you wanted to work for the government in clearing litter from the parks or scrubbing graffiti off the wall or sweeping the streets, or whether you wanted to find a job in the private sector. So it had an extremely beneficial, dynamic incentive effect on actually making sure that those job vacancies that were available were swiftly snapped up.
Right, thanks a lot. Let's get some more questions. The gentleman just over there.
Thank you. My name's Alex Houston. I'm the chairman of Conservative Future Belfast. The Northern Ireland economy is the most reliant on the state in the entire UK. It's 67% directly and 80% indirectly. To put that in context, communist East Germany was only ever 75% state economy. I live in this place. But at the minute we're trying to devolve corporation tax in Northern Ireland to put it on an equal footing with the Republic of Ireland, which is 12.5%. How would the panel feel about making Northern Ireland genuinely competitive and lowering to something like 5%?
Thank you. The lady on the second row then, please.
Mr. Kwarteng, this is particularly for you on the point about...
could you just tell us your
sorry,
name?
Hilary Will, London School of Economics, although I'm sort of speaking more personally here, about the tax rate and percentage at which you start paying a higher rate. I'm not an economist, although I work at LSE, but as the average income is more in the 20,000s rather than the 40 to 50,000s, it's really rather a point than a question. May I suggest, given that the Conservatives didn't gain a majority at the last election, if you want to increase your votes among the middle to low income workers, you may have to sort of amend your rhetoric a little bit, because it's not going to really wash with the so-called middle class if they're actually not taken into account by the comments you're making about when you reach that bracket.
Okay. Okay, right, thank you. And we'll just do one more then. Who wants to ask another question? Gentleman in the front row, please.
Nick Broom from Guildford. My concern is that I don't think the reduction in welfare payments has gone far enough in the review. I think you agree in the broad terms with that concept. We really must surely define what is lifestyle that is being supported by the welfare and withdraw it. Not perhaps immediately over a period of time, so that would be unfair. 'Cause after all, if you've had your 6 children that you're bringing up on, you know, through the welfare system, it'd be a bit unfair to withdraw it in a month. But to make quite clear in future, if you choose to have more than 2 children, fine, but you will have to pay the cost of that, not the state. And apply this across a whole range of items, not just this, that was just an example.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, so let's start with the Northern Irish question about slashing corporation tax. Does James want to start off?
I think Northern Ireland, I think one of the odd things about Northern Ireland is the devolved administration doesn't seem hugely keen on cutting corporation tax, even though that would clearly boost Northern Ireland's competitiveness. I think, as you say, Northern Ireland's, the level of state spending in Northern Ireland is simply unsustainable. And I don't think you're going to get, I don't think you're going to normalise society in Northern Ireland until you encourage enterprise far more than you've already done. I'm normally fairly sceptical of enterprise zones because I often wonder what that makes the rest of the country. But I think in Northern Ireland, there is a real case for huge cutting corporation tax in Northern Ireland down to even below the level in the Republic. Because there is such, and in fact leads to firms relocating to Northern Ireland. I mean, if you look at the specific historical problems that Northern Ireland has faced and continues to face, it's actually a price worth paying, even if that does affect the rest of the UK. Just on the point on tax, really quickly, I think there are 2 things to remember. First of all, the coalition is raising the tax threshold, which benefits all of those workers that you were talking about quite considerably. I think one of the other things is that lots of people who earn 28,000, which I think is the average wage, they aspire to earn more than that. And they look at that and they think, hang on a second, do I really want to pay 40p tax? And I think that as Kwasi said, £50,000, I don't think anyone in this country thinks that people who earn £40,000 a year are the rich. They might be wealthier than other people, but they're not the rich. And I think as Kwasi says, there is a symbolic value in £50,000. It is saying, look, we're not going to start taxing you at what is a remarkably high rate. And that 40% of every pound that you earn going to the state is a lot of money. And to say that you're going to wait to that point until people have reached a certain level is, I think, reasonable, especially when you consider where in London and the South East, where most of the people who are earning this money live, how expensive living is. You know, I don't think someone living in London earning £40,000 a year is a rich individual who can afford to give the state 40% of everything they earn.
I'd like to address both points. With regard to Northern Ireland, I tend to be slightly more in favour of special enterprise zones than some of my other colleagues in the group, and certainly possibly than James. I think they're a very good way of trying out radical ideas. We're not like America, which has 50 states, where they have different jurisdictions, and they often serve as a laboratory for really good public policy. But I think special enterprise zones could be used in this way to try and do some of the sort of free market reforms that I think will drive our prosperity in the future. And I think Northern Ireland is a very good case in which we could do that. With regard to the point about the middle earners, I think the whole issue about this is one to do with aspiration. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the 1992 general election, and Labour had a policy. I wasn't old enough to vote in it, but I was old enough to remember it. And they had a policy where they were going to raise taxes. And I remember John Smith saying, everyone who earns under £22,000, that was their threshold then in those days, will be better off. And they worked out that that was 8 out of 10 people. So 8 out of 10 people would be better off under their proposal. It was only if you started earning over 22,000 that you would be affected. And they openly said this. And of course it killed them in the South East. Not only because, as James suggested, living costs were higher and people were earning more, but that whole issue of the aspiration, that whole sense in which Labour was not aspirational and that the Tories were aspirational, was something that was played up again and again. And our biggest single winner in terms of the campaign was the Labour tax bombshell. So even on your basis, they should have been supported, because 8 out of 10 people, according to their plan, and I think they were right, weren't going to be affected. But it was that whole attack on aspiration that I think damaged them very considerably in that election. And that's what this is about. And lastly, The 40%, my whole point is that the top rate was never designed for those people. It was never designed for PAs working in the House of Commons and other people in high-skilled, white-collar jobs. But these people, as James said, are not rich. And I think something like 6 times as many people are paying this rate, as was the case in 1980. And if we're serious about incentivizing our economy, I think this has to change.
Okay. Dominic Raab.
Well, very briefly on the same point, and I think you're quite right to politically warn us about this. And we're in the business of selling proposals, so we need to think about the market for it, so to speak. But we need to bear in mind the top 10% pay 55% of the income tax, and you only have to be earning over £50,000 to be in the top 10%, which is why I think a wealth tax is so pernicious. But also there's been some interesting data that's come out of the ONS that shows it's not until you're earning somewhere between, and it's not clear because they deal in quintiles, but somewhere between £35,000 and £40,000 that you pay any net tax at all if you include all taxes and all benefits you get back from the government. Now, if I have that fact plus what you're saying, which I understand, it tells me that cutting taxes, particularly income taxes, without cutting spending is unsustainable. And that's why I try to start my remarks with talking about public spending, because what I want to do is cost it up front before I start cutting it. And I think you've got to make the case. We've got to be honest about the extent of state dependency in this country.
Okay, thanks for that. And in fact, just to add to your point, only the top 2 quintiles are now net contributors. The bottom 3 get more in benefits. In terms of services also, obviously. And what's changed in the last few years is that the middle quintile has shifted from being a net contributor to a net payer. Right. Mark.
On the point that Nick from Guildford at the front raised about welfare, I mean, I heartily agree with you. I think there are going to have to be some potentially unpopular decisions taken here. I'm conscious that the 3 gentlemen on Allister's left are very concerned about winning votes, rightly so. I don't have to be worried about winning votes. I just need to keep a very small number of board members at the IEA happy rather than the wider electorate. But the scale of welfareism and the extent to which it's got out of control is well worth underlining. 1/3 of households in the UK, 1/3 of households in the UK are now dependent upon state handouts for half or more of their household annual income. 1/3. This is absurd. This is ridiculous. This is not a welfare state that, in my view, is sensibly targeted on the relief of poverty, in which you might expect, say, the bottom 5%, the bottom 10% to be receiving the money. Fully 1/3 of households are dependent on state handouts for more than half of their income. That needs to change. One other area which I think needs looking at, and I suspect isn't particularly popular, is universal benefits to the elderly. I think it's absolutely ridiculous that my affluent father gets a free bus pass. That's absurd. And winter fuel allowance is completely mad. I mean, at the very least, wrap those benefits into the state pension. I don't know why we're favouring bus travel over, for example, him buying a bike or buying an extra pair of walking shoes. So I think we need to... There was one chap about a year ago who actually said to me, I'm very fond of my winter fuel allowance because it helps me heat my indoor swimming pool. It was difficult to understand how this was a successful poverty relief measure. So I think that we do need to look at that. I think Jacob Rees-Mogg, I believe it was Jacob Rees-Mogg, came up with a sensible and I think relatively fair way of doing this, which is to grandfather the scheme. You don't necessarily cut off those who are presently reliant on it, but you tell people in their, say, mid-50s that they will not be receiving it. So you don't actually, if you like, confiscate bus passes from people who are 72 years old, but you warn people who are 62 years old that they won't be getting one. And I think that we've got to redesign the welfare system so that incentives are properly aligned. And I do think that the Income Smith is taking some welcome steps in that direction. But we also need to get back to the core principle of it, that the target of the money, the purpose, is the bottom 10% of society, for sake of argument. Not, I mean, if you actually look at the sort of people in the UK who don't qualify for any welfare benefit, I was trying to work out who the heck it is. It seems to be me, basically. I don't give some risk my owner, I can't claim housing benefit. But the profile that you need to have in order not to be eligible for welfare is an extremely unusual one, and that's crazy. The eligibility for welfare should be that you are towards the bottom, let's say, for the sake of argument, 10% of society, and we've allowed that to get totally out of control.
Right, next round of questions. Let's start with the gentleman over there. If you could just give your name.
Yes, John Strafford from Beaconsfield. And I'm the owner of a small business, and I get very wary of politicians who talk about giving incentives to new business. Because what they don't seem to understand is that by giving incentives to new business, they make it more difficult for existing businesses to compete, and they distort the market. Which brings me to Mark Littlewood's point about 12 self-employed people. I don't know where the advantage lies in doing that, because tax would have to be deducted at source when paying them. If they were substantial, they'd have to register for VAT. They have to pay national insurance contributions. But let's just assume that there is a benefit. Well, what you're going to do is then make it then more difficult for the firm that employs 12 people as employees to compete with this new entity that you've created. So you may well put one company out of business whilst you're creating another one. And I think that governments ought to be very wary of distorting the marketplace, and particularly the IEA, in that kind of way.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman over there, yes, that's it.
Robert Higginson, Birmingham Ladywood, speaking on my own behalf. And just an incidental, I'm glad you mentioned Wisconsin, because Scott Walker is somebody that we can learn from, the governor of Wisconsin. I'm one of those who has just changed from job seekers allowance to pension credit, because it saves me the fag of signing on and a whole lot of other things, and it makes my car insurance cheaper, because putting unemployed down on my car insurance, I get penalised just for that. But just to come to the main point, I love a proposal by Daniel Hannan, which is that we replace VAT with a local tax regime, and we then are competing, and this would benefit Northern Ireland, for a lower tax take and a better value for money investment in our locality. So I think that would be something that would incentivise the economy. And just one incidental on the unemployment situation, we penalise casual work by a brick wall cut-off. And the £5 disregard hasn't risen in 20 years. And if we had a taper instead of a brick wall cut-off in job seekers' allowance deduction, we would incentivise and help the unemployed to get back into work in a casual way.
Okay, all right, thanks for that. Let's answer these questions. Mark Littlewood, do you want to just start off, and then we...
no, thanks to John from Beaconsfield raises a good point. I must admit, it's very, very rare that I'm accused in public debate of not being sufficiently free market. I assure you that's a rarity indeed, so I'm still somewhat reading from that. You raise a good point, John, and particularly on, if you like, free market principles, which I genuinely wonder whether I'm compromising. A similar example would be the issue of red tape and SMEs. You know, why should we exempt SMEs from red tape, health and safety, fire regulations, but not exempt big businesses? And you're right that there's a distortion in the marketplace. Unless that you think in this case of regulation, that the regulatory burden is effectively a poll tax on business, and the larger companies are much more able to be compliant with that. I'm attracted by my initial suggestion on this, not in this pamphlet, but in my capacity as an advisor on the Red Tape Challenge, was that any company operational in the UK should be able to redesignate any 12 staff it chooses to as self-employed consultants. I'm told that there are legal difficulties with that, in that once you've actually got a staff member who has employment rights A, B, C, D and E, telling them the next day that they no longer have those rights is difficult. But I'm still open to, if you like, exploring legal ways that we might be able to get around that, such that your putative company with 12 staff on PAYE in terms of employment rights isn't disadvantaged against me suddenly setting up against you. with 12 staff who don't have the same potential chilling burden on them. So I think there is a difficulty there. I hope it's a technical difficulty, and I wouldn't actually have a problem if a FTSE 100 company with 20,000 staff wants to redesignate 12 of its people as self-employed consultants, right? So ideally, I'd like to make it universal, but that's the difficulty and the problem I've got. There is a benefit on employers' national insurance contributions, and I think I'm right in saying that there will also be a benefit in, I think I'm right in saying that self-employed people won't have the automatic pension enrolment, which is coming in as well. So there are specific tax advantages as well as employment law advantages. But I agree with your spirit and aspiration in saying it should be a level playing field. I'm just still navigating the legal hurdles to make sure that it is.
James.
Just on the local VAT, I think it's an absolutely fantastic idea. It's sadly, as with so many good policy ideas, undoable because of EU law.
Get out of the EU.
And just one other thing, I think on the and what is very interesting is that Nick Clegg was very attracted to this idea when he first became Deputy Prime Minister. And interestingly, given Clegg's kind of pro-European views, he had no idea that EU law made it undoable. I think it would be absolutely fantastic if you had people driving from York to Newcastle to do their shopping because Newcastle had a lower VAT rate than Yorkshire. I think tax competition within the UK is actually something to be encouraged, and I would be perfectly happy to reduce the block grant to Scotland, scrap the Barnett formula, and allow Alex Salmon to compete on tax grounds with the rest of the UK. I think it would be fantastic. And just on your point about casual work, I think you're completely right. I think one of the big problems is that I understand why lots of people in this room are understandably angry about the welfare system. But I think one of the things we've got to understand is that, as you say, there is far too sharp a divide between the world of welfare and the world of work. And it can't just be unpaid work that we're encouraging people to do if they can pick it up. I think, for example, if you are an unemployed builder and you can pick up 10 hours on one random week of work, that shouldn't stand in the way of you being able to claim unemployment benefits the rest of the time. It's much healthier for both for you, for the economy and for society, for people to be doing work when they can.
I just want to make a point to you, John. John, can I see you? Good. I just wanted to say to you, hi. I just wanted to say that it's very important that we make creating businesses as simple and easy as possible. Now that's not to try and denigrate or detract from people already in business, but in terms of capital formation and employment, that initial idea in an entrepreneur's head, to realise that idea in real life, as it were, I think it's a very important thing for a government or a polity to make that transition as easy as possible. And if we go around the world and look at successful countries, you will find they have tax holidays. I went to San Francisco, the mayor of San Francisco said to me that they, in some businesses, they won't tax them for 4 years. All around the world, we see regimes, governments, political society actually helping entrepreneurs, actually helping new companies. And I think that's very, very important. That doesn't mean that we're setting them up to compete with existing companies. But in terms of capital formation and the kind of society you're trying to create or trying to foster, I think new business is very, very important.
Okay. Dominic, do you want to say? No. Okay. Right, let's move on to the next set of questions. Gentleman over there, please.
Yeah, Michael Hoskin from Eltham constituency. Just strikes me, while talking about tax, are we slightly being unambitious in talking about the tax thresholds and how, and I agree with your sentiment that you've been expressing about how it's a barrier to ambition and to incentives to work. Why don't we go for a flatter tax or some sort of system like that? Or indeed, obviously there's the public spending reductions that also be made. Are there particular reasons why, if you're going to go for something which might be unpopular among some people, why don't you go a bit further and go something that's simpler and flatter, and we'll have fewer distortions?
Okay, thank you. The lady over there, please.
Hi, Elizabeth Cross from Westminster North, but I grew up in Scunthorpe. This one's for Kwasi. Third runway. Not going to front it. We've been told at conference that there isn't going to be a third runway at Heathrow. So if this was Desert Island Discs, I'm sorry you can't include that one. So would you like to give us another third point?
Sorry, my point was more about the planning process. Okay. With regard to the third runway, I think that's still an open question because we're waiting for a report.
Can I finish the question, which was just to be, if that one isn't allowed, would you like to give us a third question, a third point? And would that, like the panellists, including the chairman, also like to offer a fourth point if they wanted to? What was your wild card, or what would you like to put in for?
Okay, we'll answer that in 2 seconds. Right.
Thank you.
I'm going to actually ask the next question now. Specifically Chris Skidmore. I'm just quite interested about your enterprise card for migration, so I'd be keen for you to say a little bit more about it, sort of elaborate a little bit on what you said. But before we just go to that, let's take these questions in turn. Who wants to start with tax? Mark, do you want to talk about flat tax?
Well, I completely agree on the simplicity and flatness of tax. It's sometimes we are in danger of talking only about the rates, and whilst I welcome the proposals put forward by in this pamphlet by Kwasi and by James on the rates, because I think they're important. That's only a part of the story, and I commend the work done by the Taxpayers Alliance on the 2020 Tax Commission, chaired by, I believe, by Allister here. I contributed to it, which I think is a ready, on-the-shelf document for a government that is serious about simplifying and flattening our tax system to implement. And it's not just about the rates, and this answers the lady's question about what, if you like, our bonus one would have been if we'd been asked for 4. I was in the difficult position of having to write my 3 once I'd seen the other 12, so some of my ideas had already been picked up by some of the others. But mine would be simplify the tax code. I think it is insane that we have a tax code of 15,000 pages in this country. The word count is several times that of War and Peace. Do not be surprised that there are unbelievably complex loopholes. No single human being could understand the entirety of tax laws in this country. That's why we have huge numbers of accountants, lawyers and experts to try and find ways around it. I'm not sure if a future government could get the entire tax code onto 15 sides of paper, but that would be about my aspiration, to cut it by 99.9% or more, simplifying tax.
Yeah, I mean the best case for simplification of the tax system is what happened to Vince Cable. I mean, Vince Cable is a politician, he's a man trying to pay his taxes, and then he finds that he's meant to have registered for VAT and have been paying VAT and didn't realise he passed the VAT threshold. I mean, that, to my mind, just embodies how ridiculously overcomplicated the tax system currently is. If you were asking for another idea, my other idea would have been 4 runways, a 4-runway airport at Stansted. I think it is kind of economic self-harm for us to be endangering London's hub aviation status. I am more, I think the politics of a third runway at Heathrow are simply too difficult. And I think 4 runways at Stansted is easier to do than Boris Island. And also I like the idea of linking up with a lot of the life sciences that are going on in East Anglia and lots of the other things there. I think it has its attractions.
With regard to the airport, my view is, my suggestion was nothing about the third runway, it was about the planning process. And I think that, I just want to say generally, this third runway debate has gone on for about 5 or 6, 7 or 8 years actually. And it's gone up and down and up and down. And I think the failure to really, I mean, it's across all governments. And I think it's something that we need to act on. And obviously Boris has come up with his scheme, and James is suggesting a full runway Stansted. These are interesting ideas, which I'd be willing to debate. But my issue was really about the planning. Of course we want flatter, simpler taxes. I mean, that's what we happen to believe as part of the free enterprise group. In a way, I feel that we're constrained by where we are. As the Americans used to say, where do we go from here? That should be the question. But generally, I have no doubt that the tax code is Byzantine, it's completely It's too complicated, and the only people who benefit from it are the lawyers and accountants and the professional services that Mark described. And I think it sort of trebled, or at least doubled, under the last government, which just shows how crazy and out of control this thing has become.
And do you have a bonus idea?
I'll come back to that.
Okay.
There are two that I'm trying to weigh up.
Okay.
Goes back. Double bonus. And we talked a lot about the dependency culture and state dependency, and I think what we need to be able to do on the centre-right is articulate something different, a sort of a leg-up culture or self-help culture, particularly in these very austere times. And I think that there is still a lack of a coherent, overarching, meritocratic view of fairness to replace the egalitarian one. And so one bonus policy that I'm attracted to, with a sort of underdog agenda in mind, is the open access scheme, which has been proposed by the Sutton Trust, which is a centre-left, Peter Lample, man in the centre-left rather than centre-right. But he's basically got 100 top private schools prepared and willing to open their doors based on selection to all children on a means-tested basis. Now, private schools operate selection, so it's not something new, it would be just democratising it. It would cost the taxpayer the equivalent of 0.3% of the Department for Education budget because of the way it would